A feeling of rage rose through Vigo's body. His neighbor had been warned not to chop down his tree. His wife called him while he was at work that day. "He's done it." Her voice was urgent. It wasn't possible for him to leave work early. His neighbor, however, had no idea what the tree was all about. It took him 20 minutes to get home. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw the carnage left by his neighbor. A melancholy stump stood where his beautiful tree once stood. He had arrived too late. His neighbor destroyed the tree in his yard without his permission. Vigo knew he would make sure his neighbor was compensated as he fell to his knees and examined the wreck. A very stupid thing had been done by Vigo's neighbor. In destroying the tree, he didn't realize what he was doing. It had other, even more serious consequences than just removing Vigo's shade from his house. A frustrated sigh escaped his lips. It was the pettiest of reasons that led the foolish neighbor to do it. Vigo would now be on his tail. Vigo was now focusing on damage control. Grabbing his phone, he dialed a number he wished he would never have to call. After they answered, he simply said, "He did it. That's right, my neighbor did it." Then he put his phone away and ended the call. His neighbor wouldn't understand what he had done until he got the bill, and then justice would be served.
But before we start, smash the like button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
A neighbor of Vigo's, Henrik, hated the tree. Leaves and berries would always fall into his yard in autumn and spring. Having to sweep them up was a hassle for the neighbor, and he wanted Vigo to know about it. He'd complained under his breath before, and Vigo knew he hated it, but he'd never acted on it. In his yard, Vigo noticed his neighbor observing a tree from his lawn just after coming back from a run. He looked frustrated and angry. His neighbor was miserable because of the tree, but Vigo couldn't get rid of it. As he ran past his house, the neighbor noticed him. It was an opportunity for him to walk up to him. A request he made was unreasonable. In anticipation of the conversation that was about to take place, Vigo awaited his arrival. His mouth opened and he said, "Hello. That tree needs to be dealt with. My yard is a mess because of it." The tree would be brought up by Henrik. He knew that. However, he was unable to provide any resolution to the frustrated man. Vigo believed that the matter had been resolved. In the following week, he noticed his neighbor clearing his yard of berries and leaves. Is this the compromise he reached? Considering helping the man out, he thought about it. When the garden gets bad, maybe he should help pay for a garden service every now and then. Vigo's neighbor would do the unthinkable before Vigo could put any plans into action. His frustration was growing as he had to clean up a mess that wasn't even his. Then he did something nobody expected. Henrik was waiting for Vigo at home one evening. The look in his eye was deranged. Vigo jumped out of his car quickly and confronted him, but he soon realized that the man had something in his hand. His blood froze when he realized what it was. Vigo's neighbor ran up to him and yelled, "That tree has caused me pain for the last time. I'll do something about it if you won't." He ran towards his neighbor. That's when Vigo realized what he was holding in his hand. When Vigo returned inside after the confrontation, his wife was watching from the window. Her face was filled with grave concern. "It seemed like he was going to kill you," she said loudly. Vigo assured her that he was wielding an axe only because of the tree. Nevertheless, he could not be excused. This is especially true now that he has snapped. His wife stayed home to take care of the property while Vigo went to work the next day. While he was away, she could stay on top of things from home. Henrik wasn't going to work either, little did the couple know. Sitting in his living room, he plotted a way to get rid of the tree and the pains that came with it. Within hours of Vigo leaving for work, Henrik had a delivery truck deliver a parcel. From the window, Vigo's wife, Joanna, watched. He was plotting something, but what? Henrik then came out with the package just minutes later. Having upgraded from the axe, he approached the tree. A feeling of rage rose through Vigo's body. In an effort to avoid having his tree cut down, he had warned his neighbor not to do so. While he was at work, he received a phone call from his wife. He's going to do it, she said urgently, but it wasn't possible for him to leave work early. His neighbor, however, had no idea what the tree was all about. Vigo has been filled with rage ever since the phone call. In spite of his best efforts, he was unable to accomplish anything at work. As soon as possible, he needed to get home. When 5 o'clock came around, he rushed to his car. Despite breaking no laws, he drove as fast as he could. Was he fast enough to stop what was happening? It took him 20 minutes to get home. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw the carnage left by his neighbor. A melancholy stump stood where his beautiful tree once stood. He arrived too late. It was impossible for him to stop his neighbor from destroying the tree in his yard. Upon examining the wreck, Vigo knew he would ensure his neighbor was compensated. Vigo listened intently as the other side of the line instructed him. The only thing he could do at the moment was wait inside his house until they arrived. Having finished the conversation, he slipped the device back into his pocket and ended the call. It wouldn't be long before justice was served. and his neighbor would understand what he did once he got the bill. Observing the mess his neighbor had made, Vigo stood silently in the middle of his yard for a moment. The tree was in bits and pieces, and his grass was covered in leaves and bark. There was no end to his fury. In the middle of his yard stood a tree that he had always admired. However, it has now been destroyed. While he raked his messy hair with a hand, his wife watched him from the kitchen window. All of this could have been prevented if Henrik had listened to him. What would they do to his neighbor when they showed up? Does he have to suffer the consequences as well? If only Henrik had paid attention to what he told him, none of this would have happened. He wouldn't have needed to make such a big deal out of it, but he had chosen to ignore all of the many warnings Vigo had issued. Now, he was facing serious repercussions, and nothing Vigo could do would change that. Besides, why would he want to? Vigo had done all he could think of to stop Henrik, but the man was incredibly stubborn, and now it was too late. He had already acted. He also had to take into account that the authorities who were en route might make the mistake of thinking Vigo was the guilty party. Fortunately, his wife had seen it all happen and quickly thought to film it for evidence. From the beginning, they had suspected that Henrik would make a move. That's why she was ready to film it to protect them from any repercussions. Relief flooded Vigo's veins as he mentally thanked his wife for protecting them with video proof. He knew what would soon happen. While he sat in the living room with his head in his hands, his wife stood in the doorway. The consequences were clear to her, and she feared the consequences as well. Soon they would arrive. There was no way Henrik could have known what he had just done. Vigo was left with no choice but to sit and wait until the car arrived. Slowly, his wife entered the room. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't comfort her husband. Though they knew Henrik had been bothered by the tree, they never imagined he would act this way. What gave him the right to step onto their lawn and damage their property? His mistake had been stupid, but now he had to deal with serious consequences. It didn't take long for Vigo to hear it. The sound of an engine got closer and closer until it was right outside of his house. He looked outside and saw a black car parked on the pavement. His heart was beating fast in his chest. When he'd first moved into the property, the previous owner warned him of what would happen if he chopped down the tree, but he never thought this would actually happen. Vigo nodded and rubbed his sweaty palms against his jeans. "Yes, sir," he responded, trying to build some confidence as he continued. "My next-door neighbor, Henrik. He has been threatening to cut the tree down for weeks now," he explained. The man wrote this information down, listening intently as Vigo retold the story. "And did you warn your neighbor not to?" "Yes," he rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Yes, sir. I warned him again and again. Recently, he bought a chainsaw and threatened to use it on the tree. When I left for work this morning, the tree was still intact." The man nodded, writing every last detail into his small notebook. "My wife called me while I was at work. She had witnessed him doing this." As Vigo looked up at his neighbor's house, he noticed Henrik standing on his front porch, watching with a frown on his face as the group of men inspected the leaves and branches on the floor. The same man who had spoken to Vigo quickly extended a hand out to Henrik, which he shook hesitantly. He wanted to know what this was about. "Hello, sir. We're with the government, and we're here to enforce the Nature Protection Act. Do you know what kind of tree you cut down, sir?" The man in charge asked the neighbor. The frustrated neighbor shook his head angrily, knowing that they were there for him. The man then explained that what he had cut down was a juniper tree. A lot of people were unaware that they were endangered in the Netherlands. "It has been making a mess all over my property, and they were refusing to do anything about it. I did what I had to do," he tried to explain himself, but it was too late. The government official let out a sigh, obviously unconvinced by Henrik's account. "I get why you're upset, sir. However, the juniper tree is considered a protected species in this area." Henrik's face paled when the man continued. "Felling a juniper without the required authorization is considered a serious offense," he proclaimed. Henrik was starting to understand what he'd done. One government man proceeded to inform Henrik of the environmental repercussions of what he had done. He emphasized that the juniper was hardly an inconvenience, it was a vital part of the local ecosystem. It contributed to the habitat of various kinds of wildlife, enhanced the air quality, and aided in stopping soil erosion. Henrik paled as the huge ripple effect of his rash decision started sinking in. Besides breaking the law, he had also directly caused damage to the environment. As the official continued to explain the legal penalties Henrik faced, the other members of the team initiated an assessment of the extent of the damage. They would have to come up with a plan for cleaning up and then restoration. The authorities would likely plant a brand new juniper tree in order to restore the local environment to its previous condition. Meanwhile, Vigo watched on as his neighbor bowed his head in defeat. It was more than obvious that Henrik had overlooked the gravity of his mistake and underestimated how serious the government was about protecting the local flora. As his new reality became apparent, Henrik was overwhelmed with shame and humiliation. He had expected that felling the tree would resolve his issues, but instead, it had only brought a much more serious problem. Vigo was torn between feeling satisfaction that Henrik had gotten his just deserts and feeling sympathy for the new situation his neighbor was in. He was happy that justice had been meted out, but Henrik's actions had clearly been negatively influenced by resentment and rage. They did give the neighbor an alternative. They told him that he wouldn't have to pay the fine if he did 8 hours of community service per week. He jumped at the opportunity. He had no idea that his simple act could get him into so much trouble. Losing that amount of money would ruin his life. He got so used to cleaning up the berries and leaves. What about trash on the highway? From that moment on, Henrik spent 8 hours every Saturday doing community service. Sometimes he would volunteer at a local library or animal shelter. Other times he would have to clear trash from the streets. He learned a valuable lesson that day and even apologized to his neighbor for what he had done. At his core, Henrik had grown into a new person. He started to champion conservation in their community, initiating campaigns that sought to increase the green space in the area and plant more trees. He didn't hesitate to tell the story of his grave mistake in order to emphasize how serious the repercussions of negligence could be. Henrik also became close friends with Vigo, and the neighbors often laughed as they reminisced about past times over coffee. They learned a lot since their battle over the juniper tree, and the whole debacle eventually strengthened their bond. Both Vigo and Henrik had learned important lessons from the conflict. Vigo now truly understood how important it was to fight for his beliefs, in spite of how frustrating it might be to deal with disagreeable neighbors. At the same time, Henrik had become enlightened about how vital it was to be respectful of both the environment and the law. He would never make the same mistake again, the cost would be too high. The community also saw improvements as a result of the neighbors' dispute, as they were both determined to maintain a more eco-friendly and unified neighborhood. The once polarizing juniper tree was now emblematic of Vigo and Henrik's shared struggle, as well as the transforming power of forgiveness. Their experience was also a lesson for the community on vulnerable flora and fauna. As the years passed, Vigo and Henrik only grew closer. They were no longer just neighbors, they had become dear friends who were there for each other when life got hard. The debacle with the juniper tree may have been distressing, but in the end, it had changed both of their lives for the better. They smiled as they watched the new tree grow strong, knowing it was a sign of new beginnings, and that it symbolized the value of compassion, forgiveness, and the unstoppable might of nature.